All right, let's dive right in. We're going to tackle one of the biggest questions in military strategy right now. Can Iran actually pull off what's called a saturation attack? We're talking about a massive, coordinated strike designed to just completely overwhelm even the most sophisticated defenses out there.
So it really boils down to this, right? Is this whole thing just a threat on paper, or could they actually swamp a technologically superior military with a flood of missiles and drones? This isn't just some academic question. The answer changes, well, pretty much everything in the region.
And you know what's kind of wild? The short answer from most analysts is, yeah, absolutely. It's not just talk, they seem to have a real, proven way to do this. But how? How did they get here, and what are the real limits? Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so to figure that out, we've got to pop the hood and look at the arsenal itself. What are the tools for the job? Because let me tell you, it's not just about having a ton of missiles. It's about having the right kind of missiles for this exact strategy.
So these are basically the big players, the workhorses of Iran's missile force. And the most important thing to know about them isn't their range, it's their fuel. See, they use solid fuel, and that is an absolute game changer. Why? Well, old-school liquid fuel rockets, they take hours to get ready. These, you can hide them, move them around on the truck, and launch them in minutes. That makes them a nightmare to find and stop before they're already flying.
And then there's this piece of tech, which is what makes the whole saturation idea so dangerous. We're not talking about one missile hitting one building. Nope. Some of these can carry what are called cluster warheads. Think of it like a missile that carries its own little swarm of mini-bombs. It breaks apart and just blankets a huge area, like an entire airfield. It's built from the ground up to overwhelm defenses.
And look, this isn't just something they've tested on a practice range. This is a proven, battle-tested capability. We've seen it in action time and time again. They've used these systems to hit targets in Syria, in Iraq, and in those really sophisticated attacks on Saudi oil facilities. So they've shown they not only have the weapons, but they know how to use them.
Okay, so we've established they've got the hardware. But why this specific hardware? Why go all in on missiles? Well, this whole arsenal is part of a much bigger strategic plan, and it's a plan that was really born out of necessity.
And that plan is called asymmetric deterrence. Sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. For decades, because of sanctions, Iran just couldn't buy a modern air force, no fancy fighter jets. So they looked back at their experience in the Iran-Iraq War and thought, okay, what can we do? The answer was, in a way, brilliant. If you can't buy a billion-dollar jet, how about building thousands of much cheaper missiles to just overwhelm the defenses protecting that jet? It's all about finding a clever, cost-effective way to pose a threat that a much more powerful military has to take seriously.
But here's the thing. They didn't just cook all this up by themselves in a lab. The big idea might be Iranian, but getting the technology to work, and getting it to work so quickly, well, that took some significant outside help.
So let's break down who helped and how. You can think of it in three parts. First, North Korea gave them the foundation, the basic blueprints. For example, Iran's famous Shahab-3 missile is basically a version of North Korea's Nodong missile. Then, you've got Russia, who acted like an accelerator. They provided more advanced tech for guidance and propulsion that probably saved Iran years, maybe even a decade of R&D. And finally, you have China playing the role of the supplier, providing a lot of the crucial chemicals needed for that solid rocket fuel we talked about earlier. Without that, the whole strategy just doesn't work.
All right, so this all sounds pretty intimidating, right? But every system has a breaking point. Every arsenal has its limits. So the big question is, what can Iran realistically do? Let's get a reality check on just how many of these huge attacks they could actually pull off if things got serious. And the magic number that analysts keep coming back to is around 1,200. Now, to be clear, that's the estimated number of active, ready-to-go ballistic missiles. The total stockpile hidden away is probably bigger, but for what they can use right now, 1,200 is the number everyone's working with.
So let's just do some quick back-of-the-napkin math to see what that means. You start with 1,200 missiles. And let's say a really big, overwhelming attack wave uses about 150 of them, which is in line with what we've seen before. Well, that means you've got enough for roughly 8 of those massive strikes. After that, you're starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel.
And that forces a really tough strategic choice, doesn't it? Do you go for maximum shock and awe with about 8 huge waves? Or do you try to stretch it out, launching smaller waves of, say, 50 to 75 missiles at a time to keep the pressure on for longer? It's a classic trade-off, intensity versus duration. And here's the single biggest problem they face, the production bottleneck. Look at it this way.
In a war, they could launch hundreds of missiles in a week, but their factories can only build a few dozen in a whole month. So once a major conflict starts, that stockpile is pretty much all they've got. They can't just build more on the fly.
And there's another really critical point to remember. It's not just about how many missiles you have, it's about how many you can launch. You need those special mobile launchers. You need crews who know how to operate them. You need all the support gear. If an enemy starts taking out those launchers, it doesn't really matter if you have thousands of missiles sitting in a bunker somewhere, you've got no way to fire them.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. We've looked at the hardware, we've looked at the strategy behind it, and we've looked at the very real limitations. So what's the final analysis? What does this all mean when you put it together?
The bottom line is pretty clear. Iran's ability to pull off this kind of attack really stands on 4 pillars. You've got decades of their own hard work, sure, but that work was built on a foundation of North Korean designs, it was sped up by Russian technology, and it's kept going by a critical supply chain from China. Take away any one of those pillars, and the whole thing gets a lot shakier.
And because those big, fancy ballistic missiles are limited and expensive, we're seeing a really interesting shift in their strategy. Their toolkit is evolving. They're leaning more and more on things that are cheaper and easier to replace, but still achieve that same asymmetric goal. We're talking about huge swarms of low-cost drones and relying on their proxy forces across the region. It's a much more sustainable way to fight a long-term conflict without using up their best, most expensive toys right away.
And that really brings us to the final and maybe most important question. It goes right back to that core idea of asymmetric deterrence. If their most powerful ballistic missiles are a finite, precious resource, what's Iran's real long-term weapon? Is it the missile itself, or is it the massive, cheap, and constantly growing network of drones and proxies that can keep the pressure on indefinitely? Something to think about.